Good morning, everybody, or good noon. Today, our AIPG-TX webinar is being given by Dr. James Conca, who is a trustee of the Herbert M. Parker Foundation at Washington State University and was a faculty member there. He is a contributor to Forbes magazine on energy issues and has been an advisor to various government agencies, as well as to President Obama's Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future. That was in the 2010s. He's worked on the Yucca Mountain and WIPP nuclear waste products for a long period of time and has a PhD in geochemistry from California Caltech and a master's in planetary science and bachelor's from Brown University. So let's go, Jim.
Hi, great. Thanks so much. I really appreciate this. And I'll just kind of run through a bunch of stuff. I love these nighttime NASA shots because you can tell right away who has energy and who doesn't. All right, what's the fighting has been about forever is what it will always be about. Now, this is distribution of energy geographically. Distribution by type is here. So this is the world in 2023. It's 2/3 fossil fuel and 1/3 split between hydro and nuclear. It's been this way for 40 years, and it's going to be this way for another 40 unless we make some dramatic changes. And whether or not you think that's necessary or not is part of this whole talk. I won't talk about transportation much, but it's dominated by petroleum. And so when people talk about decarbonization, they really usually stick with just power and energy and electricity, but they forget that petroleum is a third of all fossil fuel use. Now, these are power and transportation are not generally coupled, but if you really want to make a change in terms of decreasing petroleum use, you really need to couple these. And of course, the way to do that is through electricity, electric vehicles, or hydrogen. Now, the distribution by type is completely dependent on where you are. Of course, the United States, interestingly enough, is also about 2/3 fossil fuel still, although coal and gas have switched places here in the last 20 years. Nuclear is about 20%. It's been that way for, again, 30 years. Hydro is about 7%. Wind is coming up, of course, and solar is coming up and other, but it's still, we're 2/3 fossil fuel, and most of the rest is nuclear and hydro. But again, it depends on where you live. Texas, of course, is a lot more gas, a lot more wind. West Virginia is the largest fossil fuel use at 90% coal. Illinois is the highest nuclear use at about 50%. The European Union, a little more nuclear, a little less gas and coal because they have so much nuclear because of France, essentially. Korea, like Japan was prior to Fukushima, is, it's getting up there in nuclear, but their goal is to be 60% nuclear by 2040. That was Japan's goal as well before Fukushima. And now they're finally getting back to that. And the reason they want to be so high nuclear is because Korea, like Japan, has no resources to speak of. They have no fossil fuel to speak of. They have no renewable potential is lousy. They can't even feed themselves. So biofuels are not really reasonable. So unless you want to be completely dependent on places like China, Russia, and the United States for your energy, the best thing to do is to go nuclear. So they are planning to do that. Now, China, still mainly coal and hydro, and nuclear doesn't look like much, but they are planning to have 185 large nukes by 2035. 185. Now, we only have about 95 left. At our peak, we're about 104. But they're going to have 185. That's in their latest 5-year plan, and they stick to their 5-year plans. They're also on track. They are breaking ground on a new nuclear power plant every month, and they're bringing online a new nuclear power plant every month. So they are quite on track to have 185 nukes by 2035. Now they're going to build more coal and more gas and they're building more renewables than everyone else because they have such a need for energy. Oops. Now this is the power consumption growth curve globally. It's very steep, has nothing to do with us. We were last century. We've been pretty flat, growing a little bit, but we're about 4 trillion kilowatt hours a year. Now I'll use kilowatt hours because that's what the public understands best, because it's what you pay for and what comes in the bill at the end of the month. Generally, the United States pays about 12 to 14 cents a kilowatt hour. We up here where I am is the cheapest energy, and it's about 8 cents a kilowatt hour. And of course, Hawaii is like 35 cents a kilowatt hour. So, in fact, I apologize. I can't remember what Texas is right now, but it's probably about 15 cents a kilowatt hour, but I'm not quite sure. Apologize. Now, as I mentioned, the world is 2/3 fossil fuel and a third mainly hydro and nuclear. Now, with 27 trillion kilowatt hours a year at present, we're going to go at least to 40, and we'll talk about why. And so when people talk about decarbonization, which is kind of funny, they always think about what is at present. Okay, they never extrapolate to what it's going to be at 2040 or 2050. And so they fail to take into account a lot more energy. So they're talking about getting rid of this fossil fuel, but you're going to have to not just get rid of fossil fuel, you're going to have to come up with 20 trillion kilowatt hours just to keep fossil fuel where it's at now instead of increasing it. So the numbers are big, they're important. People don't talk about numbers. They talk about percentages, which I hate in general, because you really need to know the numbers. The numbers are huge. And that really determines what we can and cannot do. So if we get to 40 trillion kilowatt hours, we're going to require a lot more non-fossil fuel sources. Sorry, it's a bit noisy here. The reason that curve is so steep is because of these people. Okay, over 1 billion people still have no access to electricity whatsoever. 2.4 billion people still burn wood manure as their main source of energy, and 3 billion more people are going to be born by mid-century. Now, this is a lot of energy, and you might say, well, forget about them. We have ours. Who cares? Well, that's kind of nasty because it takes about 3,000 kilowatt hours per person per year to lift someone up out of poverty. And that's very interesting. It's something called the Human Development Index that you can visit. And that's important because the only way to eradicate global poverty is to give everyone 3,000 kilowatt hours per person per year. And it doesn't matter whether you were a 17th century nobleman that was getting 3,100 kilowatt hours per year off the backs of 10 slaves, 10 indentured servants, 4 horses, and 4 oxen. It's a great calculation for the students. Or everyone listening here, which is getting about 12 to 16,000 kilowatt hours per person per year off the back, mainly of fossil fuel, some nuclear and other. It doesn't matter. You need about 3,000 kilowatt hours per person per year. And this is captured in something called the Human Development Index. So I encourage you to Google UN, United Nations Human Development Index, which basically says access to energy is the first term in the equation for happiness. And I kid you not. And it's kind of funny. And so when you look at the Human Development Index, which goes from 0 to 1, 0 is complete hell and 1 is complete heaven. What's interesting is that, yeah, when you get above about 3,000 kilowatt hours per person per year, things get pretty good. So if you look at us in the energy rich area, okay, we kind of think about energy differently. We always talk about, moving us down this curve so that we're not wasting. We don't need 16,000 kilowatt hours per person per year. That's kind of wasteful. The UK is at 6,000 or so, and that's pretty good. And of course, something like Canada is big in coal, so forget it, they'll never get down very far, but there's not that many people there. So if you look at where most of the people are, we got a lot up here, but we have many more down here. Now, what's funny is that the second term in the equation of happiness is form of government. So here's Russia, Iran, and China, and you can see they're off that curve, and they should be on that curve. They have plenty of energy. And so their people should be much higher in terms of quality of life. And they're not because of the form of energy. Now, China is kind of funny here. There's two parts to China. There's 800 million in the middle class, above 3,000 kilowatt hours per person per year, but there's still 600 million in poverty. So if you look at their policies, whether it's economic or military or political, it doesn't matter. It's to get these 600 million up into the middle class. So by mid-century, China will have over 1 billion middle class. Now, the reason that's important is because your economic and military power derive directly from the absolute number, the magnitude, not the percentage, the absolute number of middle class in your society. And if you go throughout history, that you can see why Britain became the world leader. The sun never set on the British Empire in the second half of the 18th century because they developed coal, and their per capita and energy use jumped to about 4,000 kilowatt hours per person per year. So they had this huge middle class. And then, of course, we came along and we developed oil and everything else and nuclear. And so it doesn't matter. It takes however number of people in your society or is in middle class will determine your economic and military power. So there is a sweet spot, however. If you can get everyone up here, down there, and get everyone down here, up there, that is the minimum amount of power of energy, to eradicate global poverty and its evil stepchildren, war, and terrorism. So that's a big lift. It's going to take a lot of energy. And it's really important down here because people that are below 6.6, on the Human Development Index, pretty much spend 6 to 8 hours a day just getting water and food. So mainly water. So again, if you have a electric pump and you have some PVC piping, you can save a lot of time. And that's what energy does for you. It gives you time to do other things, besides just survival. And an interesting thing happens when you do get 3,000 kilowatt hours per person per year. You start thinking differently. You actually believe, and this is especially important for women, you actually believe that you will live to age 40 and that your children will live to age 40. And that is a huge change sociologically. So, and of course, what happens is you stop having children at 1 or 2. So when you do get above 6,000 kilowatt hours per person per year, the birth rate drops below 2. I mean, it plummets below 2. And that has its own issue in terms of developed countries. So again, it's kind of bizarre, but access to energy has always been, throughout history, the best method of birth control, because you start thinking about the future and you believe that your children will live to age 40. And that is not the case down here below 0.6. Now, what does that mean in terms of energy? What do we need to get everyone up out of poverty? Well, again, the industrialized world, you can cut us down to 6,000 kicking and screaming. No one likes to give up anything, but there's only 1 billion people in that subgroup. So there's a lot at 3,000, that's great. But it's these two groups, the developing world, which has 5 billion people in it, you have to get up to 3,000 kilowatt hours per person per year. And those that are coming on board, another 3 to 3.5 billion people. So what we're talking about is at least 34 trillion kilowatt hours per year to pretty much get rid of war and terrorism and to eradicate global poverty. The problem is that's the minimum amount if you distribute this energy well, and we don't distribute things equitably around the world very much. In the United States, much better, but not perfect. So we're talking about probably over 40 trillion kilowatt hours per person per year to achieve this. So I've set you up now. What's the fastest growing energy source in the world? And if we were in an auditorium, I could look at, people could just shout out I don't mind people shouting them right now, but I'll just kind of give you the answer here. It's oil. Okay, so oil is still the fastest growing energy source in the world, followed by coal and natural gas. And then hydro. Nuclear is kind of flat, although it's beginning to come up. And, renewables are coming up fast, but they're trivial compared to fossil fuel. And so again, when people talk about replacing fossil fuel, this is all you have. I mean, this is it. I mean, there's some experimental stuff, tidal energy and stuff like that, but they're nothing compared to just the wind, solar, and biomass, and the only renewables we have really at scale. And if you think you can reduce fossil fuel significantly, then you're going to have to increase all of these. You're going to have to quadruple nuclear and double hydro, and it's kind of, the numbers are large. And these are still going up. Now, I haven't taken this graph to the present yet, but if you look at just in the United States, gas-fired generation increased by 115 terawatt hours. Over the same time, solar increased 21, and we lost significant amount of wind. So again, to think that renewables are coming up anywhere near fast enough to do anything is absurd. The other thing too is that, I mean, this is the United States. If you go back to globally, if anyone thinks fossil fuels are going to decrease significantly in the next 20 years, they're not going to. I mean, just forget about it. So and don't worry about it, because people who worry that fossil fuels are going away, they don't have to worry. Not in our lifetime, certainly not. These are big numbers, and again, it's driven by those people really that need a lot more energy. Again, the United States, yeah, we have the luxury of electric vehicles and LEDs and everything else, but most of the rest of the world does not. So, why do we care about this? Pretty much, we look at carbon dioxide emissions per energy source. This is the latest from the United Nations. Nuclear actually dropped down to be the least emissive of all fossil fuel, of all energy sources. So again, it's kind of simple, not easy, but simple. These large CO2 emissions, these not very much CO2 emissions, and that's fine. Now, in this latest report in 2023, nuclear also had lower impacts on everything. It was kind of bizarre. And if you look at the actual data, I apologize for this very busy graph here. So this is life cycle impacts on human health, and these are the different standpoints. And again, fossil fuel and large hydro, in fact, have more impact than these. These don't have much impact at all. And it doesn't matter which one of these. I mean, nuclear happens to be the lowest impactive, and that includes ionizing radiation, ironically. But yeah, they're all fine. That's great. Nuclear just happens to be the best. If you look at life cycle impact on ecosystems and the same kind of thing, again, talking about freshwater eutrophication, acidification, agricultural, everything else. Again, fossil fuels have more impact, and large hydro has more impact than all of these over here. And these are all fine. Happens that nuclear happens to be the best. So as you all know, electricity is simultaneously produced, delivered, and consumed. It has to be balanced pretty much minute by minute, or you start blowing substations and transformers, or you start having blackouts. So again, they have to be managed minute by minute. And if you look at some of the control rooms, this is ISO New England. Yeah, these big screens with all the generation and consuming on it, and everyone is just watching this. And if the wind stops blowing and you lose 1,000 megawatts, suddenly you have to fire something else up quickly, or else you will risk having rolling blackouts. So in the Pacific Northwest, where I am, it's all about hydro. So we use hydro because we're 67% hydro here in Washington State. So we use hydro to balance the grid. So this is a normal balancing, load map, balancing map from Bonneville Power Administration up here. And you can see the gray line is the load. So this is what we're pulling off the grid. And you get the usual, this is for a week. So you get the usual 24-hour double hump, camel graph, where everyone wakes up and starts firing up their coffee makers and everything else. And then they go to work, and then a little break in the midday for lunch, and then it goes back up and goes down. So this repeats every day, some form or another. Weekends a little bit lower use, and weekdays a little bit higher. And you can see by hydro, which is the light blue, that it simply mimics that. I mean, we use it to load follow. Now, the fossil, thermal generators like fossil fuel and nuclear, they pretty much go along. They don't vary much at all. Nuclear doesn't vary at all, except every 2 years you have to refuel for a month. And here's the dark blue is wind. We don't have a lot of solar up here, fortunately, because we're at such a high latitude. So here's the dark blue is wind. So again, wind is very variable. So it's not doing anything, and then suddenly, on the evening of the 5th of January, it spiked, a huge amount came online. And that change has to be dealt with quickly. And so we just dumped hydro. So we dump hydro, it actually goes negative. And so you can't give it away. Sorry. And then, of course, the wind stopped blowing and went down, and so hydro went back up to load fall, and then it came on again, and so we had to dump it. So in the Pacific Northwest, all wind does is displace hydro. It doesn't displace fossil fuel, so it has absolutely no bearing on addressing climate change in the Pacific Northwest. Now in California, that's quite different. So here is a load map for one day. And there's so much solar in California, as well as wind, but mainly solar, that you have what you've all heard of as the duck curve. So what happens? The sun comes up, solar comes on big time, and everything else has to ramp down. Now there's a lot of import here, the purple, which is kind of funny because you don't have to say what is generating that import. And so in this case, it's some hydro, mainly coal, and some gas. So it's kind of hard to figure out kind of what the effect in terms of fossil fuel displacement that this is doing, because the change happened so fast. Oh, I'm sorry. This is a set of duck curves beginning in 2015 showing how it's getting more and more extreme in terms of load following. So what happens when the solar comes on, everything goes down, but then the sun sets and you have to fire things up. So in California, I'm sorry, Texas has its own duck curve because you have both wind and solar, but so much wind. So what happens is something has to fire up, and in California, it's natural gas plants. So there's a bunch of peaker plants, and you probably know what peaking plants are. They kind of sit idle all day while there's so much solar coming on, and then when the sun sets, they have to fire up. And the problem is, who pays for idling a dozen gas plants, waiting for the sun to go down? And of course, that cost is never figured into the cost of wind and solar. So it's very interesting too, because the capacity factor, which we'll talk about, for these peaker plants, meaning the amount of energy they're producing compared to the amount they could produce, is only about 2.6%, which is absolutely ridiculous. So they're basically acting like an idling battery, and they only come on when solar goes away at the end of the day, and then of course the use goes down, and they also go down in the nighttime. So if you have a dozen of these peaking, trying to load follow solar, it's actually quite a big cost. So we get to capacity factor. So these are average capacity factors for the United States. historically. Okay, so new plants are changing a little bit, but this is historic. So the capacity factor, again, you probably all know this, is the annual average percent of the maximum output possible. And if you want to, if you want to understand or calculate how much power a unit or farm or um, wind farm or solar array is producing, or nuclear or coal or anything else is producing per year, you do the installed capacity, which is what it's supposed to be, like 1,000 megawatts, times the capacity factor, times the number of hours in a year, and that's how much it's going to produce, period. No more than that, a little bit less if there's some mechanical issues that have to be dealt with, but pretty much that's what you're going to get. So if you look at nuclear, which is just runs all the time, it's over 90% capacity factor. In fact, the nuclear power plant near where I am, Columbia Generating Station in Washington State, its capacity factor has been averaging 98 to 99%, which is absolutely amazing. Again, they only have to shut down every 2 years to fuel, and the new designs for nuclear, are much better than that. So the capacity factors, you never have pretty much have to shut most of these new plants down in order even to refuel. Now, natural gas is about 60%. And people ask, well, why is it more? Well, there's a couple of issues with natural gas. One, it's actually more expensive than people think. There are times during the day when it's very expensive, so you don't want to run natural gas during those times. Also, there's issues with supply if you don't have enough pipeline supply to deal with it, like Texas had to deal with a few years ago. Then you have a problem there as well. Coal, about 47, say 50% of the time. Coal has to refuel an awful lot. I mean, for 1,000 megawatt coal plant, you pretty much have to roll in 10,000 tons of coal a day, which is rather extreme. Hydropower, it's only about 40%. And again, you might say, well, why isn't it more than that? It's that water is used for so many other things. It's used for irrigation. It's used for flood control. These dams do other things besides provide power. So they're pretty much only about 40%. Wind is about 35%, and solar is about 25%. Now, it really depends on where you are. Again, in California, the capacity factor for wind is only about 26%. Now in Tornado Alley, again, going up from Central Texas up to Nebraska, the capacity factor is almost double. So again, if you want to get more bang for the buck out of wind, it should be built in Tornado Alley. It should not be built in California. And where I am here in Eastern Washington, the capacity factor is only 27%. So, and they're building a bunch of new wind farms here. And it's like, well, that's kind of dumb. You don't get much energy out of them here. So it's very important to maximize the energy you get out of these systems in order to minimize the economic effect. And so, so if we go back up here to the top and we actually calculate, so when people compare something like nuclear or gas or something to wind and solar, they never compare apples to apples. I mean, it's just kind of funny. So if you take 1,000 megawatt nuclear power plant and you multiply it by the capacity factor times the amount of hours per year, this is the amount of energy, about 8 million megawatt hours per year. This is the amount of energy that unit is going to produce. Could be a little bit more, a little bit less, but that's it. Wind farm, 1,000 megawatt installed capacity times capacity factor times, let's talk about in Texas, times 8766 hours a year. It's only going to produce a little over 2 million megawatt hours. So you can't compare one nuclear power plant to a wind farm of the same capacity. You have to compare 4 wind farms of that capacity to that nuclear power plant. And that's per year. It gets a little worse in terms of total life cycle, because over its life, that nuclear power plant, which is 80 years, the design life of nuclear power plants is 80 years, not 40. 40 is just a regulatory number picked out of the air by the Atomic Energy Commission in 1957 as a good time to look at relicensing a nuclear power plant. But the design life is 80 years. And some of the new designs are even longer than that. So over its life, it's going to produce over 600 million megawatt hours. And the same size wind farm is only going to produce about 60. So we're talking about a factor of 10. So again, if you're looking at cost, you have to compare apples to apples. So you have to compare 10 1,000 megawatt wind farm with 1,000 megawatt nuclear. So for nuclear to produce this amount of energy, a single 1,000 megawatt nuclear power plant is going to cost, and we don't have time to go through all of this, but this has been calculated many times. And it's going to cost about $22 billion plus $2 billion for externalities. Wind, the same, to produce the same amount, is going to cost about 23 billion and an 11 billion for externalities, because again, the firming, the requirement for load following wind is very expensive. And we never used to include that in the cost, but now we do. And not just that, but the something called the effective load carrying capability of wind. When can you depend on it? That's what the effective load carrying capability is. When things are bad, when it's really cold or really hot, when you really need the energy most, what can you depend? What can you depend on from wind? And its only terms in Texas is about 10% of its nameplate capacity. So if you, I'm sorry, this is California. California has about 6,000 megawatts of wind, and you can only depend on 600 megawatts of that power to actually be generated on the coldest, warmest days in the region. So one of the problems with wind, as you probably know, when it's really cold or really hot, the wind doesn't blow. And so wind is really not a good source to depend on during extreme weather events. So it really depends on where you build these units. So if you look at a wind map, wind potential across the United States, yeah, here's Tornado Valley. So yeah, Texas, great, all the way up to North Dakota. This is where you want to build wind. And then you use high voltage transmission lines, particularly DC lines, to get it out to where you need it. There's very little areas outside that you should not be building wind in Georgia. I mean, that is absolutely dumb. A technical term there, dumb. Because you're not going to get much energy out of them. Same thing with solar. So you don't build solar near Seattle. You don't build solar in Maine. The latitude matters. You build it in southwestern United States. That's where you get the biggest bang for the buck, and your capacity factors will be maximum. Now, hydro is kind of interesting. There's a study recently done by Oak Ridge National Laboratory and the National Hydropower Association that shows we could double hydro in America without building a single new dam. There's a lot of dams, and these show the larger ones in the United States that are not producing any power. They're dams for irrigation or flood control or whatever, but they don't produce, or transportation, but they don't produce power. You could, much cheaper and much easier than building new dams, you could simply power up a small percentage of these, and you could double the capacity of hydro in America. This is the lowest hanging fruit. Now, the reason it matters where you put power plants is because of the amount of materials. If you look at, this is mass of steel in million metric tons versus mass of concrete in million metric tons to produce 600 million megawatt hours of electricity over its life. So if you look at wind, of course, yeah, it takes a lot of steel, a lot of concrete, a lot of copper, a lot of neodymium, and all the other stuff too. But just, steel versus steel and concrete, it is the most material intensive source of energy there is. Solar is about half of each of those. Hydro, a lot of concrete, but not much steel. Coal, half of hydro, a quarter of wind, and then gas and nuclear, which just don't require many materials at all. And it's kind of funny because you think of a nuclear plant, huge amount of concrete, but really doesn't, it's not that much compared to the amount of energy it produces, because it produces so much energy. Natural gas, of course, just doesn't require anything. You can throw up a natural gas plant in a year. That's why state legislators love them, because gas is relatively cheap. So yeah, so in terms of materials, nuclear and gas are the best, without question. And of course, these materials become more expensive in a carbon-constrained economy. Now, you probably know the geometallurgist Simon Michaud, who just put out a 1,000-page report about the amount of materials needed to decarbonize the world. And it turns out the rate-limiting step is copper. So he estimated we're going to need about 4.2 billion tons of copper by 2050 to decarbonize. And throughout all of human history, we've only mined 700 million tons. And even if we don't decarbonize, we'll still need another 700 million tons over the next 20 years for business as usual. And this is a problem. We've mined out most of the high-grade ores, and copper is recycled like crazy. It's the best material to recycle. And so now we're getting to lower grade ores, require much more energy per ton to accumulate. So, and the similar things occur. You've all heard about, lithium, cobalt, everything else, but it actually is copper that is the rate limiting step for decarbonization, or for all energy, period. Now, if we talk about where I am, hydro makes the Pacific Northwest energy rich, and wind makes it capacity poor, like I mentioned. So this is where grid scale storage comes in. It's desperately needed. We don't have a good supply of it, because we keep thinking about batteries. Now, grid scale battery storage, very expensive, requires huge amounts of critical metals like lithium and cobalt. And we really need those for fully electric vehicles, which is pretty much the only way to get rid of oil. Hydrogen coming up, but it can't really do much in the next 20 years. The infrastructure is not there. We do have the infrastructure to support electric vehicles. And so that's pretty much the only thing we can do, although we're not doing it very quickly. Now, gravitational potential energy systems are the best and the cheapest. So you probably heard of pumped hydro. So it uses wind or solar energy whenever it's produced to lift something like water up a few hundred feet and then let it come back down under the force of gravity, drives a generator, produces electricity. It's about 90% efficient, just about the same as lithium. And in fact, pumped hydro storage represents 97% of global storage and 75% of California storage. And it actually accounts for 40% of the renewable energy credit. Now, new gravitational potential energy sources using heavy materials like cement instead of water actually show quite a bit of promise. So if you look at a pumped hydro storage facility, again, you have a lower reservoir, an upper reservoir. You just use your intermittent energy production to move water up to the upper reservoir, and when you need it, you let it out. I mean, it's actually quite simple. Maintenance is very easy and simple. It's not that expensive, much less expensive than batteries. So here's one that has been running in Germany since 1958. And right now it's backing up 132 megawatt wind turbines. That's not that one there. That's just a local thing. But yeah, so it's easy, it's simple, works great. Don't need anything special to do it. Now, there are new materials, new technologies. This is called the Energy Vault, but there's a few of them. Basically, you have this big facility that has 35-ton cement bricks, and they're actually green cement, which is quite funny and really neat. So instead of moving water uphill, you pretty much raise these 35-ton cement bricks up 300 feet and then let them out when you need it. And the nice thing about this, of course, is it does not require water. And so Saudi Arabia is building some of these to back up their solar panels that they have installed. Now, if you talk to leading climate science, you all remember Jim Hansen, and I've worked with him. He's still around and still saying the same thing. We need nuclear. You cannot do this. You cannot address climate change without a significant amount of nuclear, and you can't decarbonize without serious amount of nuclear. And again, what you think about decarbonization doesn't really matter. You know, we have lots of fossil fuel, of course, as you all know. But if you're going to decarbonize, you better have a lot of nuclear. And if you're going to bring on a lot of renewables, then you're going to have nuclear or gas to load follow it. So there are new nuclear, something called small modular reactors. You probably all heard about that a lot. They're as good at natural gas, in fact, and better than hydro at load following or buffering the renewables. Now, SMRs cannot melt down. I mean, they can't. I can't believe it took us this long to figure that out, but we know how to make them so they can't melt down. We know what to do with the waste. Now, this is my expertise. Piece of cake. We know where to put it, how to do it. It's fairly cheap, easy, very safe. We're just not allowed to do it. But we have been idle in the last 30 years, and there's plans exist for 2 or 3 in California and elsewhere. So these are the 3 ones that are farthest along. TerraPower, Bill Gates's company, you probably know that. He bought a nuclear company about 15 years ago, or put together a nuclear company. And they're building their first one in Wyoming on a coal site. And the nice thing about building nuclear at coal sites is that, one, you can use about 50% of the infrastructure that already exists, since all you're doing is changing the way you're heating water to steam. So you can use 50% of the infrastructure that's there for coal, and you can use 80% of the workforce. Only 20% really needs to be retrained for nuclear. Again, most of the activity of a power plant is producing steam and generating electricity. It has nothing to do with the source of the heat. So you can use 80% of the workforce and 50% of the infrastructure, which really reduces the cost, and also helps the economy of the area, because shutting down a coal plant really devastates a local economy. Now, X energy is what you've probably heard of a pebble bed reactor. So the fuel is in little pebbles that cannot melt down. So that's nice, and it's at high temperature, so you can use the temperature produced to do other things like chemical manufacturing and things like that, desalinization. And then NuScale's SMR is just pretty much just a scaled down nuclear plant. And when you scale it down that far, the surface area to volume ratio goes up. And if you put it below grade, then the heat can be dissipated without any need to have water or pumps or anything else. So here's Bill Gates's design. And again, this is grade. So this is the core is below ground. And this is, they also have a sodium loop that is a huge chemical battery for excess energy. This is the pebbles. So these are the pebble bed reactor, X Energy, which is being built in Texas along the Gulf Coast. Dow Energy decided to use this pebble bed reactor to provide energy for the chemical manufacturing plants along the Gulf Coast. And NuScale is, again, it's just a nice small, it's only about 60 acres total. And again, can't melt down. None of these can melt down. So how do we achieve a low carbon future for Texas? Well, the energy mix last year was about this. And so you got to get rid of coal and gas if you want to decarbonize. Okay, if you want to. That means you need to bring nuclear up dramatically. I don't think much more wind is useful, and solar. Okay, you need to bring that up too. I mean, this is, you can play with this all you want, but if you're going to decarbonize, you have to get rid of coal and gas. Now, the generation in 2022 was 440 terawatt hours, about 20 grid scale storage units, and about 220,000 EVs. Now, if you're gonna, again, if you're gonna decarbonize, if you want to, by 2035, you're gonna, the state is looking to increase its energy use by about 150 terawatt hours, mainly because from um, from data centers, which you take a huge amount of energy, Bitcoin, things like that. So AI, the amount of energy use is going to dramatically increase, and this is probably way too low, considering the rate at which we are building data centers and the rate at which AI is coming up, and Bitcoin as well. So you're going to have about 100 grid scale energy storage units like pumped hydro, about this size, and you're going to have over 20 million EVs. The amount of EVs we are building in the world is trivial compared to the amount of internal combustion gas engines. We've in the, yeah, let me see. By 2035, it's estimated we'll have at most 30 million EVs worldwide. But we'll have about 3 billion internal combustion engines. So it's not going to make a dent in petroleum, the way it's going. So if we want to make a dent in petroleum, we need to build many more EVs. But then we're going to need a lot more lithium. Now, if Texas gets to 20 million EVs, you're going to need about 70 trillion watt hours just to fuel or charge those EVs. Now, this mix will cost Texas about $900 billion. But again, it's over 15 years. It's not that much, actually, of which 500 billion is capital investment. Because when you decarbonize, your capital investment requirements skyrocket. Because you're actually building things and not just burning fuel. Now, in America, a low carbon plan will require a lot more. So 500,000 new megawatts of wind, 200,000 new megawatts of nuclear, 300,000 new megawatts of solar, and 120 new megawatts of hydro, with 80,000 megawatts of existing hydro. So this is going to cost about 9 trillion, of which 4 trillion is capital. Now, over the same time period, if we just did business as usual, didn't do anything else, just business as usual, it's going to cost, hey, $9 trillion, about the same, of which only 1.7 trillion is capital. Now, this is key, because, yeah, the total cost is about the same, which is kind of funny. But the capital is much higher, and that means upfront costs. So when you ask the people of this country, hey, you're going to fork up a couple more trillion up front, but don't worry, you'll get it back later. They don't believe that. No one likes that idea. So the idea that business as usual doesn't require as much capital, but still costs the same, keep that in mind. For the world, again, the numbers get kind of ridiculous. And so it's going to cost 68 trillion kilowatt hours, of which 28 trillion is capital. So whenever we attend these climate meetings, the COP24 and up, the only question is, who's going to pay for this? So, and of course, it's going to be the US, the European Union, or China. We're the only ones that have enough money to do that. So all the other questions are quite trivial compared to who's going to pay for this. In fact, on that thought, how much will it cost to achieve an acceptable energy mix? Again, if you care about this, if you want to address climate change in this way, as well as simply develop, what's what I want, adapt to a changing climate, because that's the easiest way to deal with this, is to adapt to it. And we're not doing that very well. Just look at these hurricanes of the last few weeks. So a concept to keep in mind when talking about cost is, are the costs amongst the various energy sources sufficiently different to justify unethical decisions? I mean, I know this is America, we have to make a buck, that's great. but are you making enough bucks to justify the decisions you're making? Now, there's a great study by Carrie King at UT Austin that shows that energy as a function of GDP, and it's interesting normalizing this over the last 1,000 years or so. Energy has never been cheaper than it is now. And what's interesting is that food and fuel go hand in hand. So food, contrary to what everyone thinks, at the supermarket right now, food has never been cheaper than it in all of history, as a percent of GDP. So, and right here you can see the really change came during the Industrial Revolution. Again, coal came on, and the cost of energy just plummeted. It went up a little bit. This actually is the oil embargo of 73 that you can see. But again, things are very cheap in terms of energy, very cheap. So if you're going to make major changes, this is kind of the time to do it. And so levelized cost of energy. I mean, this is what state legislatures and everyone wants to hear. How much is it going to cost? All in life cycle costs to produce a kilowatt hour of electricity. So there's something called levelized costs, and you all know of Lazard, which is the one everyone looks at. And so this is for the Pacific Northwest up here. It's variable around the country depending on the resources available. So we have so much hydro. So this is from the last Northwest Integrated Resource Plan, and this is cents per kilowatt hour to do these. And so yeah, so new coal is expensive, new hydro is expensive. These are all pretty much the same, and that's kind of funny because if you care to decarbonize, then these are all within a penny of each of the average. I mean, it's not, yeah, gas is the cheapest. Then if all you cared about was money, well, okay, we're going to be a natural gas nation. We have tons of natural gas. Sorry, hold on a second. So, so again, I was thinking, keep in mind, what you're going for. If it's just cheap, then sure, gas. But if you actually want to change the mix, these are all pretty much the same. Now, Lazard finally came out last year with their firming costs. So again, load following, these peaker gas plants or nuclear or whatever, or hydro, whatever you're using to firm the grid against the intermittency of renewables, they finally came up with numbers for this. So this, and again, it changes across the country. So these are 4 different grid areas. And yeah, so this the light color tan is the cost of firming. So some people say, oh yeah, well, the cost of wind or and solar is pretty cheap. Yeah, but the cost to firm it pretty much doubles it. Now, there are some areas where that doesn't occur. And again, it depends on where you are, but in general, the cost of firming doubles the cost of renewables. And that is never included in anyone's calculations. So getting back to this graph, sure. So all the relative costs, you have to include the peaker plants. And if you include the peaker plants and the cost of idling them and then, firing them up every night, that's going to cost you. So IHS Markit, before they got subsumed by a larger company, did an analysis of these. And so all in life cycle cost, the cost of existing hydro is the cheapest. So up where I am, where we're 67% hydro, this is good news. So you don't want to start taking out hydroelectric dams for whatever reason, because it is the cheapest form by far of anything. Existing nuclear is the next cheapest. New gas is the next cheapest, but if you even think there's a net zero possibility, carbon capture, whatever, which does not look likely, it's going to increase that cost. But again, new gas is the third most cost effective. New nuclear, a little bit more than that. New wind and new solar are actually very expensive when you get all the costs all in. It's not cheap at all. And remember, the taxpayer subsidies don't reduce the cost, they just shift the cost from the ratepayers to the taxpayers. And since we don't know where a tax goes anyway, then it gets lost in the shuffle. But someone's paying for it. And so what are these externalities? And they're basically grouped into environmental and health costs. So this is, and people talk about carbon taxes, and that may or may not be useful. So just using a $15 per ton carbon tax, this is the increase in cost of electricity for each of these for each of these sources. And the little brown square is 4 grams of CO2 emitted per kilowatt hour produced. And the blue square is the area needed to produce 1 billion kilowatt hours per year. So again, just comparing these, of course, CO2, fossil fuels, all about CO2. New renewables, it's all about area. CO2 is up there, but not that big. And for nuclear, it's neither. So it takes a little, very small footprint and very small CO2 footprint. The lowest, in fact, it's much lower than, it's about half that of wind, according to the new UN numbers. So again, if you do put a carbon tax in, it's not going to affect these much, of course. It's going to affect these. But again, a penny and a half really is not that much. And I used a fairly high capacity factor for coal and gas, because they could be this high if you wanted to run them that high. Now, what about the other? Oh, I'm sorry, I should back up a little bit. We don't really know how to capture the cost of the area required, and the European Union assigned $100 an acre for simple footprint costs. They kind of picked that out of the air, I think, but that's what I used to calculate the effective area. What about death? Okay, so coal kills so many people, so let's push that off to the side. If you really need an evil, fine, coal can be that if you need it. Gas a lot better, hydro's a lot better. Now, these are global numbers, not US, global numbers. And again, for these three, for solar, wind, and nuclear, they're just accidents. I mean, I can't believe so many people still fall off of wind turbines during maintenance. It's kind of absurd, but that's okay. They're very, very low numbers. And nuclear, of course, is the lowest of all. If you look at the actual numbers to these, so coal kills globally about 100,000 people per trillion kilowatt hours produced. China's a bit higher, although this is coming down. A couple of years ago, this number was 250,000. The United States, we only kill 10,000 with coal. That should, in a group, that should get a laugh, but it's still pretty high. Oil, yeah, pretty high. Natural gas, much lower. Biofuel. The World Health Organization just ranked biofuel as a major health epidemic in the developing world because of poor ventilation. Then these solar, wind, hydro, nuclear, these are all straight accidents. Now, again, this is global. So for coal, hydro, and nuclear, I have a global average and a US average. And again, coal versus global versus US, it's a factor of 10. Hydro versus US, it's a factor of well over 1,000, and nuclear, kind of the same thing. So again, there's reasons for this. So when I ask students, why is this number for coal so much less than the global average? Why do we kill so few people compared to the global average? And the answer to that, and people shout out whatever, but the answer is the Clean Air Act. Okay, that's why we have dropped this number so far, because of the Clean Air Act of 1972, I think it was, or 6, I can't remember exactly. Hydro is because of FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They actually inspect dams, and they inspected a large dam up near me, Peace Rapids, a few years ago, and they found a crack in the cement, and they said, "You're going to fix this, or we'll shut you down." Now, in many other countries, the first indication of a problem, first indication of a problem is the dam fails and wipes out an entire village. So that's why the number for the global number for hydro is so much higher than the US. Nuclear, it's the same thing. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission is the most strict regulatory body in the world in history. I love it. People say, it's in the pocket of the industry. The industry wishes NRC was in its pocket because they'll shut you down for almost nothing. And that's why no one ever dies. So this number 0.1 for nuclear is just one person that fell off scaffolding and broke his neck. I think it was at Browns Ferry a couple of years ago. So that's it. I mean, it's just an accident. No one dies of radiation around a nuclear power plant. The same thing with hydro. This is a couple of people that died by falling off high places and breaking their necks. That's it.
Jim, we're officially out of time now.
Well, then here's China. Here's they putting up these. And then I wanted to get to this, but we can open up for questions if you want to, or else I can do this last thing that might be interesting to people. What do you think?
I think we better draw it to a close because we only have very few minutes for questions now.
Okay,
we're officially over time.
So why is everyone so afraid of nuclear? Because we told them to be. Incorrect but intentional association with weapons, inaccurate and purposely simplistic modeling, and misunderstanding about the amount and nature of nuclear waste. There's hardly any of it. So we actually have a nuclear repository, deep geologic nuclear repository. It's called WIP. It was designed and built for everything. It was only licensed for a certain type of defense waste called transuranic, but piece of cake. We know how to do it. We're just not allowed to do it. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. We've got a few minutes for questions, so if anybody has any, raise your hand and we'll put them on the chat and Jim will address them. No questions.
The chat. Let me see.
Yeah, the chat is open, but there's no questions at the moment. I don't see any raised hands either. And so Michael says outstanding presentation. Mike Campbell, that is by Dr. Conca.
Thank you, Mike.
And I think it was too. And my worry is the amount of copper that would be required. I started out my life as an exploration geologist for copper in the Central African copper belt, and I am very aware of the grade issues. We've run out of running room for exploration for the types of deposits we understand. We're in a shift towards trying to understand the new set of types of deposits, which is going to slow down exploration for a while. And copper mining is very environmentally destructive. Very much so.
Yes.
So more questions now, a whole bunch. So Pamela Jackson would have liked to see the rest. So what about next month, Jim?
Yes, sure. Well, I am talking next month, right?
Yes, you are. So Pamela, I'm sure Jim can merge what he didn't get to today into next month's presentation. Question about hydrogen gas produced by the Earth, not manufactured. Is that possibly a partial?
Yeah, solution? I mean, again, it's a good potential, but it'll take time, and it takes the infrastructure to both capture it and to distribute it is not there. And I don't think 20 years is enough. One of the, if you just look historically, it takes about 30 years for new technologies to cross all of society. So if you look back at like the trains or automobiles, the telephone, the internet, whatever, it takes about 30 years from when it's available and ready to when it actually is implemented throughout society. People don't realize that. You know, we can have the greatest technology in the world, but it just takes a while to implement it. Now, that might be a little faster with time, you know, relative to the past, but you just can't snap your fingers and get the infrastructure there for something so different like hydrogen.
Right. And that's a factor in exploration for the materials we need, lithium and copper and whatever else. It takes probably 20 to 30 years from discovery to production minimum for a very large mine.
Yeah, so I have to say, to permit power plants, we're trying to get that down. It shouldn't take more than 5 years, and it should only take 2 or 3 years. In terms of nuclear, the problem we had in the past is that all the nuclear power plants are all different. We never made one identical to another. We were playing. We really were playing around. And so you have to pick a couple of designs and stay with it. And so that when you know, cookie cutter like France did, and so both the permitting time and the construction time will drop significantly if they're all the same. But if you keep building different ones, no, that, you know, it'll just keep taking too long.
Any more questions that haven't? I think you've addressed everything that's on that I can see on here now. So I'd like to, we're about 6 minutes over. So I'd like to thank you very much, Jim. I found this personally humongously interesting.
Thank you. That's great stuff. That's great stuff. I must say, but I have to just say in the end here, all you know, the same. We are not going to get rid of fossil fuel in our lives. Period. Just forget it. It'll maybe by the end of the century.
Right. Well, then there's the question. The question that I've looked at a bit is not the question of getting rid of it, but the worry is, will we be able to continue ramping up production of fossil fuels the way we've ramped it up? But that's a whole nother topic indeed. So we'll leave that. Anyway, Jim, thanks very, very much for a wonderful, wonderful talk. And we look forward to hearing your second installment next month.
Excellent.
And I think everybody has really probably benefited a lot from hearing this. I just wish some of these specs could get out into the wider public more readily.
Yeah. No, I know. And any, you know, any other questions, you can always email me. You can send everyone my email if you want.
Yes, and the other thing is it is recorded, and the recording will be available. So thank you very much to Wendy and Kathy for doing that.
And Jim, will we be able to get the presentation slides that we could so we could PDF and have them available online?
Yeah, I'm not good at decreasing file size, so you know, it's like 100 megabytes. So I'll chop it up into the different.
PDF can reduce it.
Yeah, no, even then I use too many, you know, images and but I'll chop it up into like 5 different emails and it'll get to you.
Okay. For
Thanks.
that, or I can give you a share folder to upload.
Oh yeah, so that's right. That'd be easier. So
okay. All right. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, everybody. Thanks for Wendy and Kathy organizing the logistics end of it. Thanks very much.
Welcome.
Thank you, Jim.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.